The house I was renting that winter was way out on a rural route, a good 20 minutes from the nearest town, and even that's being generous. It was my first time living completely on my own, a little two-bedroom bungalow on a couple of acres of land, mostly just empty fields and skeletal-looking woods. I loved the solitude, or at least I thought I did. The first major snowstorm of the season was predicted to be a big one, a nor'easter that the news was calling a once-in-a-decade event. I was excited. I stocked up on firewood, canned soup, and coffee, ready to be properly snowed in. It felt like an adventure, a cozy little challenge. The snow started around dusk, just a few lazy flakes, but by the time I'd finished dinner, it was a full-on blizzard. The wind was shrieking, and the snow was coming down so thick and fast it was like the world had been erased and replaced with a swirling vortex of white. I had a fire roaring in the hearth, a good book in my lap, and a mug of hot chocolate on the table beside me. It was perfect. The very definition of cozy. The road I lived on was a low-priority route for the county, so I knew I'd be on my own for a while. That was fine by me. The only sign of civilization I expected to see was the eventual rumble of the snowplow. And sure enough, around 10 p.m., I heard it. A deep, guttural grinding noise that cut through the howl of the wind. I went to the living room window, pulling back the curtain to peek outside, and there it was. A huge, monstrous county plow, its single amber light strobing, cutting a slow, deliberate path through the accumulating drifts. The sheer power of it was mesmerizing. It was a reassuring sight, a reminder that the world was still out there, that I wasn't completely cut off. The plow reached the edge of my property line, and then it did something I thought was a little odd. It stopped. It just sat there, idling at the end of my long driveway, its big amber light pulsing rhythmically, illuminating the thick curtain of falling snow. The engine was a low, heavy thrum. I couldn't see the driver through the cab window. The angle was wrong and the snow was too dense. I figured he was just taking a short break, maybe having a sip of coffee from a thermos. It was a tough job after all. I watched for another minute or two, and then, with a hydraulic hiss and a crunch of gears, the plow continued on its way down the road, disappearing into the white chaos. I went back to my book, but the image of the plow sitting there, silent and watchful, stuck with me. An hour passed. The fire crackled. The wind howled, and then I heard it again. The grinding rumble. I glanced at the clock. 11:15 p.m. It seemed too soon for another pass, but what did I know? I went back to the window. There it was again. The same plow, its amber light a lonely star in the blizzard. It moved at the same slow, deliberate pace. And once again, when it reached the end of my driveway, it stopped. It sat in the exact same spot. This time, it felt different. The first time was a curiosity. This time, it was a prickle of unease on the back of my neck. Why stop there, specifically? My house was the only one on this particular stretch of road. There were no turn-offs, no intersections, just my little driveway leading to my little house, an island in the snow. I stared, trying to see into the cab, but it was impossible. The light just kept strobing. On, off, on, off. It felt like a heartbeat, or a slow, deliberate blink. My own heart was starting to beat a little faster. This isn't right, I thought. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a mechanical issue. Maybe he was checking a map. But for 5 solid minutes, it just sat there, engine rumbling, light pulsing. Then, just like before, it lurched forward and continued down the road, vanishing once more. I couldn't read anymore. The cozy feeling was gone, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. I went around and checked the locks on the doors, something I'd already done. The back door, the front door, both solid. I peered out the back kitchen window. Nothing but a maelstrom of snow, the woods a dark, menacing line in the distance. I felt foolish. I was letting the isolation get to me, letting my imagination run away. It's just a plow driver doing his job. At 12:30 a.m., it came back. This time, my blood ran cold. The sound of its approach didn't feel reassuring anymore. It felt predatory. I didn't go to the window right away. I stood in the middle of the living room, my body rigid, listening to the grinding get closer, closer, closer. When I knew it was there, I forced myself to look, It was stopped in the same spot, but something was different. The big plow blade on the front was angled slightly, pointed more directly toward my driveway. And the light, it wasn't just strobing anymore. It was angled up, aimed right at my living room window. The beam cut through the snow, not as a searchlight, but as a spotlight. It was shining directly on me. I jumped back from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt like I'd been caught, exposed. This was not protocol. This was not a coincidence. This was deliberate. Someone was in that truck, and they knew I was here, and they wanted me to know they were there. My mind raced. Who did I know who drove a plow? No one. Was it some local I'd accidentally offended at the grocery store? A random act of intimidation, or something worse? The house, which had felt so warm and secure, now felt like a fragile, transparent box. The single light held me hostage. I couldn't go near the front windows without being seen. I crawled on the floor into the kitchen and peeked out the side window. All I could see was the pulsing orange glow reflected on the side of my house, painting the snow in terrifying flashes. The low thrum of the engine was a constant, oppressive presence. It was the sound of my own fear. I had no cell service this far out. My only link to the outside world was the landline. I crawled over to it, my hand shaking as I picked up the receiver. I needed to call someone. The police, a friend, anyone. I held it to my ear. There was no dial tone, it was just dead, silent air. Panic, cold and sharp, stabbed into my gut. Had the line been cut? It was possible in a storm like this, of course. But the timing, it was too perfect. I was truly cut off now. It was just me and the man in the plow. The house was silent except for the wind, my own ragged breathing, and that ceaseless, rumbling engine just yards away. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably 15 or 20 minutes, nothing changed. The light stayed on my house. The engine stayed on. Then I heard a new sound. A loud metallic clang. It was the sound of a heavy truck door being slammed shut. My breath hitched in my throat. He was getting out. I scrambled away from the phone, crab walking backward into the darkest corner of the kitchen, trying to make myself as small as possible. My eyes were glued to the front of the house, to the thin slice of the living room I could see. I was waiting for a shadow to fall across the window, for the crunch of boots in the snow, for the rattle of the doorknob. Every creak of the house was him. Every gust of wind was his breath. The silence between the howls was him listening for me. I was no longer a person in a house. I was prey in a trap. My thoughts were a frantic, looping mess. I thought about the cast iron skillet on the stove, the fireplace poker, anything I could use to defend myself. But the thought of confronting whatever was outside was paralyzing. The fear was a physical weight, pressing me down into the floor. And then, I heard another clang, the truck door again, followed by the hydraulic hiss of the plow blade straightening out. The engine roared, louder this time. I held my breath, listening. The grinding sound started again, but it was getting fainter. It was moving away. I stayed huddled on the floor for a long time, too scared to move. I strained my ears, listening for its return, but the only sound was the wind. Slowly, cautiously, I crawled back to the living room window. The spotlight was gone. I peered outside. The plow was gone. The only evidence it had ever been. There was the freshly cleared patch of road and the deep, unsettling tire tracks sitting exactly where it had stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor in the dark, my back against the wall, watching the front door until the sun came up. The snow finally stopped in the early morning, leaving behind a world of pristine, beautiful white. The dead silence of the landline was somehow more terrifying in the daylight. A neighbor from a few miles down the road eventually came by on his tractor to clear my driveway in the afternoon. I asked him, my voice trembling, if he knew who drove the county plow on this road. He gave me a strange look. "County plow," he said. "They ain't been out this way yet." Line was down on the main road. A bunch of poles snapped. "They won't get to these back roads till tomorrow at the earliest." I just stared at him, the blood draining from my face. I told him I'd seen one, 3 times during the night. He just shrugged, figuring I was mistaken, that the isolation had made me see things. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I never found out who was in that truck. I never found out why they stopped at my house, why they shined that light on me, or why my phone line went dead at the exact same time. Was it a real plow that had been stolen? Or something else entirely, using the cover of the storm as its camouflage? I don't have any answers. All I know is that I broke my lease and moved back to the city a week later. I'll never live in a remote place again. And now, whenever it snows, I don't see beauty. I just see the perfect cover for the monsters. I pull the curtains tight, and I pray I don't hear the rumble of the plow coming down my street. My parents had this cabin up in the mountains, a place they built themselves in the late 80s. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple A-frame with a big stone fireplace and a loft for sleeping. After they passed, my brother and I inherited it. He had a family and a busy job, so he rarely made it up there. But for me, it was a sanctuary. I'm a graphic designer and work from home, so a few times a year, I'd pack up my laptop and my dog, a golden retriever named Bodhi, and head up there for a week or two of total peace and quiet. This particular trip was in late January. I was craving that deep, mountain silence. The forecast called for a dusting of snow, maybe a few inches, which was perfect. Just enough to make everything look clean and new. The first couple of days were idyllic. Crisp, cold air, clear blue skies, and long walks with Bodhi through the pine-scented woods. On the third night, the snow started. But it wasn't a dusting. It was a deluge. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a strange quiet. The usual night sounds, the chirping of crickets, the distant call of an owl, were gone, muffled. I looked out the window and my jaw dropped. At least 2 feet of heavy, wet snow had already fallen, and it was still coming down in thick, silent sheets. The power was out. It wasn't a surprise. The lines up there were notoriously fickle. I lit a few kerosene lamps, got the fire going strong again, and settled into an armchair with Bodhi snoring at my feet. There was something primal and comforting about it. The world outside had disappeared, and it was just me and my dog, safe in our little bubble of warmth and light. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, the gray morning light was filtering through the windows. The snow had stopped. I got up and stretched, my back stiff from sleeping in the chair. Bodhi was already at the back door, his tail thumping against the wood, whining softly. He needed to go out. I pulled on my boots and a heavy jacket, opened the door, and was met with a breathtaking sight. Everything was covered in a thick, perfect, untouched blanket of snow. It must have been close to 3 feet deep. The sun was just starting to peek over the ridge, making the entire landscape glitter like it was covered in diamonds. There was no wind. The silence was absolute. It was one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen. Bodhi plunged into the snow, happily burrowing his face in it. I was about to call him back in when I saw them. And my heart just stopped. Leading from the dark, dense tree line at the edge of the property was a single set of footprints. They were pressed deep into the otherwise pristine snow. They weren't animal tracks. They were barefoot, human footprints. Each one was perfectly formed, the deep impression of a heel and arch, 5 distinct toes. In this temperature, in this much snow, that was impossible. Nobody could walk barefoot in this without immediate, crippling frostbite. My eyes followed the track. It came in a straight, deliberate line from the woods. It crossed the 30 yards of open space directly to the back of the cabin. The prints went right up to the wooden deck, stopping less than a foot from the back door. My door. The one Bodhi and I had just come through. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. There was only one set of tracks. They led from the woods to my door. There were no tracks leading away. I stood there, frozen in place, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. It didn't make any sense. A person would have had to walk out of the woods, approach my house, and then what? Vanish into thin air. The snow was deep and soft. There was no way to hide a second set of tracks. There was no disturbance anywhere else. Just this single, impossible line etched into the perfect white canvas. Body started barking. It wasn't his usual playful bark. It was a low, guttural growl, directed at the woods where the tracks originated. The hair on his back was standing up. He knew something was wrong. My blood turned to ice. The beautiful silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt watchful, malevolent. I grabbed Bodhi by the collar and hauled him back inside, slamming and locking the door. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely work the deadbolt. I ran to the window, my heart pounding in my ears. The footprints were still there, mocking me with their impossibility. My mind was a whirlwind of frantic, useless thoughts. Was it a prank? Who would do this? And how? Fly away, climb onto the roof. I looked up. The A-frame roof was steep and slick with snow. There was no ladder, no way to get up there without leaving some kind of mark. And there were no marks. The person who made those tracks had to have come to my door and stayed there. But no one had knocked. No one had tried the handle. I was a light sleeper, and with the power out, the cabin had been dead quiet. I would have heard something. Body would have gone crazy. Unless they were still out there. Hiding, waiting, or worse. The thought hit me like a physical blow. What if they were already inside? I had slept in a chair in the main room. The loft, the small bathroom, the little kitchenette area. I hadn't been in any of those places since before I fell asleep. My sanctuary had instantly transformed into a cage, and I didn't know if I was locked in with the monster, or if it was still circling outside. With Bodhi growling softly at my side, I began the most terrifying search of my life. I grabbed the heaviest fireplace poker I could find, its iron tip feeling laughably inadequate. My every sense was on high alert. The creak of the floorboards under my own feet made me jump. Every shadow in the corners of the room seemed to coalesce into a human form. I checked the bathroom first. Shower curtain pulled back. Nothing. The kitchenette. The small pantry empty. That left only the loft. The loft was dark, the only light coming from the main floor below. The ladder was steep. I took a deep breath, the cold air burning my lungs, and started to climb. Poker held out in front of me like a sword. Body whined at the bottom, too scared to follow. My head cleared the floor of the loft. I scanned the small space, 2 twin beds, a small dresser. The shadows were deep. I strained my eyes, my heart feeling like it was going to explode out of my chest. Nothing. It was empty. A wave of relief washed over me, so intense it made me dizzy. I was alone in the cabin, but the relief was short-lived. Because if they weren't inside the house, and they hadn't walked away, then what the hell had happened? The logical part of my brain was screaming, but it had no answers. I spent the rest of the day in a state of high anxiety, constantly peering out the window at the footprints. They never changed. They just sat there, a testament to something my mind couldn't accept. I couldn't bring myself to go outside. Bodhi wouldn't even go near the back door. We were prisoners. As dusk began to settle, casting long, blue shadows across the snow, a new fear began to creep in. The sun was going down. Night was coming. And I would have to spend another night in this cabin, with the full knowledge that something inexplicable and terrifying had paid me a visit. I barricaded the doors. I pushed a heavy armchair in front of the front door and a dresser in front of the back. It felt pathetic, but it was all I could do. I kept the kerosene lamps burning bright all night, and I sat up with the poker in my lap, listening. Body stayed by my side, never settling, letting out a low growl every now and then. The night was agonizingly long. Every sound from the house settling, every gust of wind, was the sound of those bare feet walking on my deck, of a hand reaching for the doorknob. But nothing happened. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I packed a small bag with essentials, loaded up Body, and made my way out the front door. I didn't even look toward the back of the house. I trudged through the deep snow to my car, my legs burning with the effort. It took me over an hour to dig the car out enough to even attempt to drive. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched from the woods. When I finally got the car started and onto the semi-plowed road, I chanced one last look back at the cabin. From the road, I could just see the corner of the backyard. The footprints were still there, unchanged. A single straight line from the woods to my door. I have never been back to the cabin. My brother thinks I'm crazy. He went up a few weeks later and said there was nothing there, of course. The snow had melted. He said I must have been dreaming, that the isolation played tricks on my mind. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a dream. It was real. I don't know what made those footprints. I don't know if it was a person or something else. I don't know what it wanted or where it went. And that's what haunts me. It's the not knowing. It's the image of those perfect, bare feet in the snow, a riddle with no answer. It's the chilling, absolute certainty that I was visited by something that does not obey the rules of our world. And sometimes, in the dead of winter, I'll wake up in the middle of the night in my safe, city apartment, and I'll have to fight the urge to go to the window and check the fresh snow for a single line of footprints leading to my door and nowhere else. I used to live in this old pre-war apartment building in a city that gets absolutely hammered with snow every winter. It was one of those classic buildings, ornate but crumbling, with high ceilings, drafty windows, and a steam heating system that was probably installed when the building first went up. It was a character-filled place, which is a nice way of saying it was old and noisy. You could hear everything. Your upstairs neighbor walking across the floor, the muffled sounds of TVs from next door, the rumble of the pipes. The heart of the building was the heating system. Big, cast, iron radiators in every room that would hiss and clang and gurgle all winter long. And connecting them all was a network of old metal vents. I was on the third floor of a 5-story building, smack in the middle. I was used to the noise. In a way, it was comforting. A reminder that you weren't alone. That is, until the big blizzard hit that February. They called it a snowpocalypse. The city shut down completely. No cars, no buses, no people on the streets. For the first time since I'd moved in, the city outside my window was silent, and the silence was heavy. Inside, though, the building was alive. The boiler in the basement was working overtime, and the pipes and radiators were making a racket. It was on the first night of the snow, in that I started to hear something new. It was faint, coming from the large air return vent in my living room wall. It was a voice, a whisper. At first, I dismissed it. The vents carried sound in weird ways. I'd heard snippets of arguments, music, crying babies. It was probably just my neighbors, their voices traveling through the building's metallic skeleton. I turned up my TV and tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. The whispering was persistent. It was too low to make out any words, just a soft, sibilant sound like someone murmuring right into the vent. I turned the TV off and knelt on the floor, putting my ear close to the cold metal grate. The whispering was clearer now. It wasn't a conversation. It was just one voice, a man's voice, speaking in a low, monotonous tone. It sounded like he was reading something. I still couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was unnerving. It was rhythmic, almost like a chant. This is creepy, I thought, but it's just the neighbors. Maybe the guy next door, Mr. Henderson, was a weirdo who liked to read aloud to himself. I tried to put it out of my mind, but the next day it was still there. All day, the constant, low murmur from the wall. It was like having a constant, unwanted companion in my apartment. The silence of the snow outside made it even more pronounced. It was the only sound besides the hissing of the radiator. By the second night, my nerves were starting to fray. I hadn't seen another soul since the storm began. The building felt deserted, even though I knew people were in their apartments. The whispering was getting to me. I pressed my ear against the vent again, determined to understand what was being said. I held my breath and listened. And then I heard a word, my name. It was unmistakable. In the middle of the low, indecipherable murmuring, my name was spoken, clear as a bell. Sarah. I recoiled from the vent like I'd been burned. My heart felt like it had seized in my chest. This wasn't possible. It had to be a coincidence. Maybe he said, Shara, or something that sounded like my name. It had to be. I stood in the middle of my living room, my body trembling. The whispering continued, a soft, insidious drone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was going crazy. Cabin fever. The isolation was getting to me. But the sound was so real. I spent the next hour in a state of sheer terror, pacing my apartment, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. Finally, I decided I had to do something. I needed to know if it was Mr. Henderson next door. I went to our shared wall and pressed my ear against it. Nothing. The sound was only coming from the vent. Desperate, I went to the vent in my bedroom. It was connected to the same system. I knelt down. The whispering was there too. Fainter but there. The same low male voice. I listened, my body tense for what felt like an eternity. And then it happened again. "I see you, Sarah." The words were so clear, so direct, it was like he was standing on the other side of the grate. I screamed and scrambled backward, crashing into my nightstand. Panic. Absolute, blind panic. This wasn't a neighbor. This wasn't a crossed wire. Someone was in the walls of my building, and they knew my name, and they could see me. How could they see me? I looked around my room wildly. The vent, the grate had slats. Was there a camera? Was someone physically in the crawl space between the walls? The thought made my skin crawl. The building, my home, felt violated, tainted. The very air felt poisonous. I had to get out. But the snow was waist deep. The city was at a standstill. I was trapped. My phone was working, thank God. I thought about calling the police. But what would I say? There's a man whispering my name from my heating vent. They would think I was having a psychotic break. The whispering stopped. The sudden silence was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. I sat on my bed, shaking for hours. I didn't sleep. I just watched the vent, waiting. The next morning, the third day of the storm, I was a wreck. I was exhausted, paranoid, and questioning my own sanity. I hadn't heard the voice since that horrifying moment in the bedroom. I was starting to wonder if I had hallucinated the whole thing. Maybe the stress had finally broken me. Then, I went to make coffee. As I walked through my living room, I noticed something on the floor, right in front of the main vent. A small pile of gray dust. It hadn't been there before. I knelt down cautiously. It looked like crumbled plaster or drywall. I looked at the vent grate. One of the screws on the corner looked looser, like it had been tampered with. My blood ran cold. He had tried to get in. Or out, that was it. I didn't care if the police thought I was crazy. I called them. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, trying not to sound hysterical. The dispatcher was skeptical, but she must have heard the genuine terror in my voice. She told me they would try to get a unit to me, but it could be hours. While I waited, I armed myself with a kitchen knife, and I barricaded my bedroom door. I wasn't going back into the living room. I sat on my bed, my phone in my hand, my eyes glued to the vent on my bedroom wall. Then I heard a new sound. Not whispering, a scratching. A faint, rhythmic scratching sound coming from inside the wall. It was the sound of metal on metal. The screw. He was trying to take the grate off the vent, from the inside. Tears were streaming down my face now. I was whispering, please, no, over and over again. The scratching was getting louder, more frantic. I could hear his breathing now, too. It was ragged, excited. It was the sound of a predator closing in on its prey. Just when I thought the screws were going to give way, I heard a loud banging. Not from the vent, from my apartment door. Police. Open up. I have never felt such a wave of relief in my entire life. I screamed back that I was in the bedroom, that he was in the walls. I heard them break down my front door. The scratching in the vent stopped instantly. I heard the officers shouting, moving through my apartment. A few minutes later, one of them knocked on my bedroom door, identified himself, and I finally, shakily opened it. They found him, not in my apartment. They followed the noise complaints, mine, and apparently several others that had come in over the past year that had been dismissed as building noise. They found a crawl space, an old service duct that ran between the walls of the building, accessible from a sealed-off panel in the basement. He had been living in there, a transient who had found a way in months ago. He had set up a little nest for himself in the walls right next to my apartment. He had a sleeping bag, bottles of water, food wrappers. He had been tapping into the building's electricity, and he had been watching the tenants. He had drilled tiny pinhole openings into the ducts, allowing him to look into the apartments. He listened. He learned our names, our routines. He was the building's ghost. The police said he was rambling, mentally unwell. He had fixated on me. He thought we had a connection. The whispering was him talking to me, telling me about his day. When I heard him say he could see me, it wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. He was watching me through a tiny hole he had drilled in the metal. They took him away. The building management sealed up the crawl space properly this time. But I couldn't stay. I moved out a week later. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I couldn't stand the sound of a radiator hissing. To this day, I can't live in an apartment. I need to be in a house where I can see all four walls, where I know what's inside them. Because sometimes, the monster isn't trying to break in from the outside. Sometimes, it's been living in the walls all along, listening to your every breath, learning your name, and just waiting for the world to go quiet enough for you to finally hear it whispering back. My daughter Lily was 7 that year, and she was obsessed with snowmen. Not just building them, but the idea of them. She believed, with the unshakable conviction of a child, that they came to life when no one was watching, like in the cartoons she loved. I always thought it was sweet, an innocent fantasy. I don't think that anymore. We were living in a new housing development at the time, the kind where all the houses look vaguely the same, and the trees are still too young to give any real privacy. Our backyard ended at a small, wooded conservation area. It was mid-December, and the first real, sticking snow of the season began to fall one Saturday afternoon. Lily was ecstatic. She bundled up in her bright pink snowsuit and dragged me outside, insisting we had to build the best snowman ever. The snow was perfect for it, wet and heavy. We rolled the 3 giant spheres, me doing most of the heavy lifting, of course. We anchored it in the center of the backyard, a perfect vantage point from my kitchen window. We gave it charcoal eyes, a carrot nose, and a goofy, smiling mouth made of pebbles. Lily insisted he needed arms, so we found a couple of gnarled branches from the edge of the woods. Finally, she wrapped her own spare scarf around its neck and placed my old, floppy gardening hat on its head. He was a cheerful-looking fellow. Lily named him Frosty, naturally. We played outside until our fingers were numb and our cheeks were raw from the cold. As dusk fell, the snow started coming down harder. The forecast had updated. A blizzard warning was now in effect. By the time I had Lily tucked into bed, the world outside was a swirling tempest of white. I stood in the warm, quiet kitchen, sipping a cup of tea, and looked out the window into the backyard. The security light on the back of the house cast a cone of light, and in the middle of it, there he was, Frosty. He looked kind of lonely out there in the storm, a solitary, happy figure being slowly buried. A cute domestic scene. I smiled and went to bed. I woke up sometime deep in the night. It was the silence that woke me, I think. The wind had died down. I glanced at the clock, 3:17 a.m. I had a weird, nagging feeling of unease. I slipped out of bed and padded to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I filled the glass, my eyes were drawn to the window. The security light was still on, casting its glow on the fresh, deep snow, and on Frosty. But he looked different. I squinted, trying to understand what was wrong. The hat. The floppy gardening hat was tilted at a slightly different angle, more jaunty, and his head, it seemed to be turned. Just a fraction. Before, he had been looking straight ahead, at the back of my house. Now, he seemed to be looking slightly to the left, more towards Lily's bedroom window. I shook my head, my logical brain kicking in immediately. The wind. It must have been the wind. It was a blizzard after all. A strong gust could have easily shifted the hat and maybe even settled the head a bit differently on the body. Of course. That was the only explanation. Still, the image was unsettling. I took my water and went back to bed, forcing the ridiculous thought from my mind. The next morning, the world was white and quiet. The snow had stopped, leaving nearly 2 feet of powder. Lily ran to the window to check on her creation. "He's still there," she squealed with delight. I came and stood beside her, coffee in hand, and looked out. And a cold dread washed over me. It wasn't just the hat anymore. One of his stick arms, the right one, was no longer pointing out to the side. It was bent downwards, the twiggy fingers, just inches from the snowy ground. It looked like he was bracing himself, and his head was definitely turned more now. There was no mistaking it. He was looking directly at Lily's window. The wind must have been really strong last night, I said, my voice sounding tight and unnatural to my own ears. I was trying to reassure myself as much as Lily. "No, Mommy," Lily said matter-of-factly. "He's just moving. I told you they do." Her innocence, which had been so charming yesterday, now sent a shiver down my spine. I watched the snowman all day. I felt insane, obsessively peeking through the blinds every few minutes while I tried to work. Nothing changed. He just stood there, his charcoal eyes fixed on my daughter's room, his one arm bent down. The day was bright and sunny. In the daylight, my fears felt absurd. "It's a pile of packed snow, for God's sake. Get a grip." As evening approached, so did my anxiety. The setting sun cast long, creepy shadows across the yard. The snowman's shadow stretched out, a dark, distorted figure that reached all the way to the foundation of our house. I made sure the back door was locked and bolted. I drew the curtains on the kitchen window. But it didn't help. I knew he was out there. After putting Lily to bed, I couldn't resist. I had to look again. I crept into the dark kitchen and peeked through a tiny gap in the curtains. My breath caught in my throat. He was no longer in the center of the yard. I swear on my life, he was at least 10 feet closer to the house. There was no trail, no disturbed snow behind him. The yard was a perfect, smooth sea of white, except for the place where he had been, which now looked like a faint, circular depression, and the place where he was now. It was impossible. Absolutely, fundamentally impossible. My mind was screaming. I was seeing things. I was having some kind of breakdown. It was the only explanation that made any sense. But my heart knew better. I felt a primal fear that I had never experienced before. It was the fear of the irrational made real. I backed away from the window, my body trembling. I thought about calling my husband, who was stuck out of town on a business trip because of the storm. What would I say? "The snowman is moving." He would think I'd lost my mind. I checked on Lily. She was sleeping soundly, oblivious. I stood in her room for a moment, looking out her window. From this angle, I was looking down at the snowman. His pebble smile seemed to be wider now, more like a sneer, and his charcoal eyes stared right back up at me, at the window. I spent the rest of the night on the couch in the living room, a heavy kitchen knife on the cushion beside me. I didn't sleep. I just listened. The house was silent. Around 4 a.m. I heard a sound. A soft, scraping sound. It was coming from the back of the house. I froze, straining to hear. It came again. A dull thump, scrape against the siding. It was low to the ground, right below Lily's window. My mind went into overdrive. Was it the snowman physically scraping against my house? The thought was so ludicrous I almost laughed, a hysterical bubble of panic rising in my throat. Or was it something else? Someone else. Someone using the snowman as a distraction, moving it themselves to terrorize me. That was a more logical fear, but somehow it was even more terrifying. A person with that kind of malicious intent was a real, tangible threat. I crept to Lily's room. I had to get her. I scooped her sleeping form out of her bed, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would wake her. She just stirred and mumbled, burying her face in my shoulder. I carried her back to the living room and huddled with her on the couch, as far from the back of the house as possible. The scraping continued intermittently for another hour. A thump here, a long dragging sound there. And then it stopped. The sun started to rise. The ordeal was over. When the light filled the house, I forced myself to go to the kitchen and look. I pulled the curtains back, my hand shaking. He was on the deck. The snowman was standing on my wooden deck, less than 3 feet from the glass of the sliding door. Its body was misshapen and crumbling from the journey. The hat was gone. The carrot nose had fallen out. One of the charcoal eyes was missing, leaving a dark, empty socket. And the pebble's smile was a grotesque, jagged line. Its stick arms were pressed flat against the glass of the door. I didn't scream. I was beyond screaming. I just stood there, staring into that one charcoal eye, a cold, dead certainty washing over me. This was real. And then I saw it. Just behind the snowman in the snow-covered yard, I saw the tracks. Not the smooth, dragged mark of a rolled ball of snow, but footprints. Large, booted footprints. A single set of tracks leading from the conservation woods to the place where the snowman had first been, to the place it had been moved to, and then up onto my deck. And leading away from my deck, back into the woods, was another set of tracks. Relief and terror warred within me. It was a person. A human being had been in my yard all night, terrorizing me, moving that snowman like some kind of sick puppet. He had been there, just feet away from me and my daughter, hiding in the dark. The scraping sound was him on his hands and knees, pushing that massive ball of snow across the yard. The thought of that dedication, that silent, malicious effort, was horrifying. I called the police. They came and took a report. They saw the footprints, the snowman on the deck. They took it seriously. They searched the woods but found nothing. The tracks just disappeared into the dense thicket. They told me it was likely a twisted prank, someone trying to scare the new family in the neighborhood. They promised to patrol the area more frequently. We moved a few months later. I couldn't stand the sight of that backyard. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched from the woods. My husband thinks the story ends there. A terrifying prank by some local degenerate. But there's one detail I've never told him, or the police, or anyone. As the officers were taking my statement in the kitchen, Lily, who had woken up and was now sitting at the table, was drawing on a piece of paper. When the police left, I went to see what she had drawn. It was a picture of our house. And in the backyard stood the snowman. But standing next to the snowman, holding its stick hand, was another figure. It was tall and skinny with long, gangly arms, just like the snowman's. It had no face, just a blank, white circle. And written underneath it in Lily's crayon scrawl was the word, Frosty's dad. She looked up at me, her expression perfectly serious, and said, "Frosty was sad he was alone, Mommy. So his dad came out of the woods to help him move closer to us." I don't know what was in my yard that night. Was it just a cruel prankster? Or was it something else, drawn out of the woods by my daughter's innocent belief? I don't have an answer. All I know is that children's fantasies can be powerful things. And sometimes, when a child builds a snowman and wishes hard enough for it to come to life, they might not be the only one who is listening. Last winter, I took a job house sitting. The pay was fantastic, which was the main draw, as I was a graduate student buried in debt. The gig was for 2 weeks, over the Christmas holiday, for a family I'd never met. I found the ad online. It was all very professional. We had a video call with the homeowner, a friendly, well-spoken man named Mr. Alistair Finch. He showed me around the house via his tablet. It was a beautiful modern home, all glass and dark wood, situated on a private lake, about an hour north of the city. He explained that he and his family were going on a European vacation, and they just needed someone to be present, collect the mail, and make sure the pipes didn't freeze if a cold snap hit. The isolation was a selling point for me. I had my thesis to write. 2 weeks of uninterrupted quiet in a luxury house sounded like a dream. He left the key in a lockbox and I drove up on the first day, a week before Christmas. The house was even more stunning in person. It sat at the end of a long, winding private road. The nearest neighbor was at least a mile away. As I settled in, a light snow began to fall. It was picturesque. I set up my laptop on a huge oak dining table with a panoramic view of the frozen lake and got to work. For the first few days, everything was perfect. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own typing and the hum of the high-end refrigerator. The snow fell on and off, blanketing the landscape in a serene white. I felt safe, comfortable, and productive. Mr. Finch had left a detailed, multi-page guide to the house, how to operate the complicated thermostat, the Wi-Fi password, emergency contacts. He seemed incredibly organized and thoughtful. The trouble started on the fourth night. A major snowstorm blew in, much heavier than predicted. The wind howled, rattling the huge plate glass windows. The power flickered a few times before finally dying completely, plunging the house into a profound darkness and silence. I wasn't too worried. The guide Mr. Finch had left mentioned a backup generator. I found it in the garage, and after a few tries, it roared to life, restoring power to the essentials: a few lights, the fridge, and the heating system. It was while I was in the garage that I first noticed it. Tucked away in a corner, under a dusty tarp, was a stack of what looked like old paintings, turned to face the wall. Curiosity got the better of me. I was supposed to be here for 2 weeks. A little snooping couldn't hurt. I lifted the tarp. They weren't paintings, they were portraits, all of the same woman. She was beautiful, with sharp features and sad, dark eyes. There were at least a dozen of them in different styles, some looking formal, others candid. But in every single one, she wore the same unsettling, melancholic expression. I figured she must be Mrs. Finch. It was odd that none of these were hanging in the house, but I shrugged it off, covered them back up, and went inside. Later that night, with the blizzard raging outside, I decided to take a break from my thesis. I browsed the impressive bookshelf in the study. Mr. Finch had great taste. Tucked between some classic novels, I found a leather-bound photo album. I figured I'd see some happy family vacation photos, maybe get a better sense of the people whose home I was occupying. The album was old. The first few pages were filled with black and white photos of the house itself, but it looked different. Older, more of a rustic cabin than a modern marvel. Then came the pictures of people, a smiling man and a woman, the woman from the portraits. But here, in these older photos, she was smiling, genuinely happy. There were photos of them on the lake, having picnics, building the house. The man in these photos was not the man I had video chatted with. This man was rugged, with a kind face and a thick beard. I flipped through, confused. Maybe the woman had remarried. The last few pages of the album were empty, with clear signs that photos had been torn out, leaving little paper scars behind. The very last photo that remained was a chilling one. It was a picture of the woman standing alone in front of the house. She was no longer smiling. She looked thin, haunted. It was the same sad expression from the portraits in the garage. Written in neat cursive at the bottom of the page was a date from 15 years ago. A prickle of unease ran down my spine. This wasn't just idle curiosity anymore. I felt like I had stumbled onto a private tragedy. I put the album back, my mind racing. Who was the man from the video call Mr. Finch? And who was this woman? Needing to distract myself, I decided to make some tea. As I stood in the sleek, modern kitchen, my eyes drifted to the guide Mr. Finch had left me. It was sitting on the counter, a thick stack of papers. On the last page was the list of emergency contacts. The plumber, the electrician, the local police. And then one labeled, "In case of personal emergency, neighbor." There was a name, John, and a phone number. My cell phone had no service this far out, but the house had a landline that worked on the generator. On a whim, a stupid, inexplicable impulse, I picked it up and dialed the number. I don't even know what I was going to say. Maybe just check in, ask if his power was out too. A man answered on the second ring. His voice was gravelly old. "Hello? Hi, this is going to sound strange." I started. "I'm House, sitting for the Finches next door," and the man cut me off. His voice was sharp, urgent. "The Finches? Son, who did you say you were working for?" "Alistair Finch," I said. "He hired me to watch the house while they're in Europe." There was a long, dead silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and full of a cold dread that seeped through the phone and into my bones. "There's no one by that name," the man said slowly. "No one's lived in that house for over a decade. Not since Eleanor passed." "Eleanor?" I asked, my throat suddenly dry. "The woman from the photos. You've seen pictures of her." He sounded surprised. "My God. Son, you need to listen to me very carefully. The man who built that house, my friend, was named David. His wife was Eleanor. He built that house for her 15 years ago. She disappeared in a blizzard just like this one. They found her body in the spring in the lake. David, he lost his mind with grief. He sold the place a year later and moved away. Some rich city developer bought it, tore down most of the old cabin, and built the glass monstrosity that's there now. But he never moved in. It's been empty ever since. Cursed, the locals say. My heart was hammering. The sleek, modern house around me suddenly felt alien, a facade. But who did I talk to? I saw him, on a video call. He showed me the whole house. I don't know. The neighbor, John, whispered. But he's not the owner. You're not in the Finch house. You're in the Miller house. And you need to get out of there. Now. Just then, the generator sputtered and died. The house was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness and silence. Even the blizzard outside seemed to have gone quiet. I was still holding the dead phone to my ear. My hand was shaking violently. I was in the wrong house. Or rather, I was in the right house. But I had been brought here under a complete lie. The man on the video call, Mr. Finch, was not the owner. He was someone who knew the house was empty. Someone who had access. Someone who had a key to the lockbox. Someone who had lured me here. But why? I fumbled for my phone, using its screen for light. I had to get out. I ran to the front door, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous, dark space. I fumbled with the locks. The door wouldn't budge. It was blocked from the outside, a heavy drift of snow, or something else. I ran to the back door. Same thing. The sliding glass doors in the living room had no exterior handles. I was trapped. That's when I heard it. A floorboard creaking, upstairs. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I wasn't alone. The power outage, the generator failing, it was deliberate. He hadn't left. He was here. He had been here the whole time, hiding, waiting for the storm to seal me in completely. My mind flashed to the portraits in the garage. The sad, haunted eyes of Eleanor, the pages torn from the photo album. The man on the video call. He hadn't been friendly. He had been assessing me, making sure I was the right fit. Someone quiet, a student. Someone who wouldn't be missed right away. I heard another creak. He was coming down the stairs. Slowly, deliberately. I scrambled away from the door, my phone's weak light dancing frantically around the room. I ducked behind a large, minimalist sofa, my body curled into a tight ball. My mind was a blank wall of pure terror. This was a trap, a carefully constructed, week-long trap. The house wasn't a sanctuary, it was a cage. It was his stage. I could hear his soft footsteps on the hardwood floor of the living room now. I held my breath, praying he couldn't hear the frantic thumping of my own heart. He was humming. A quiet, tuneless, awful little song. He walked over to the windows overlooking the frozen lake. I could just see his silhouette against the faint, gray light of the blizzard. He stood there for a long time, looking out at the snow. She always loved the snow, he said, his voice calm, conversational, as if he were speaking to someone right next to him. She looked so peaceful, under the ice. He turned slowly from the window, and he looked directly at the couch where I was hiding. He smiled. It was the same friendly, reassuring smile from the video call. "Don't you agree?" he asked. "I think it's time for a new portrait." I don't remember screaming. I don't remember how I got out. The neighbor, John, told the police later that he heard the sound of shattering glass echo across the lake. And then he saw the frantic beam of a cell phone light, bobbing through the blizzard. He got in his truck and drove as far down the private road as he could. He found me half frozen and hysterical, collapsed in the snow. I had thrown a heavy floor lamp through one of the plate glass windows and scrambled out, cutting myself to ribbons in the process. When the police finally got to the house, it was empty. He was gone. There was no sign of anyone else having been there, except for my things in the broken window. They found the portraits in the garage. They found the photo album. After some digging, they identified the man from my description. He was a former art student, a failed artist who had become obsessed with the story of Eleanor Miller, the woman who had disappeared. He saw her as a tragic muse. He had been stalking the empty house for years, treating it as his own personal shrine. The police believe he lured me there to be his next subject, to recreate the tragedy, to capture what he called the beauty of despair, in the perfect, isolated setting. They never caught him. Sometimes I think he's still out there, searching online for another house, sitter, another quiet, remote location, another muse. I finished my thesis, but I never told my professor the real reason I needed an extension. How could I explain that I spent a week living in a ghost story, only to find out the monster was not only real, but had personally invited me in and was waiting for the snow to fall to lock the door behind me? Living alone has its perks. You get to control the remote, eat cereal for dinner, and leave your socks on the floor. But there's a downside, a vulnerability that hums just beneath the surface. It's a feeling that becomes amplified when you live in the middle of nowhere, like I did. My house was an old farmhouse, the only structure on a long dirt road, surrounded by acres of fallow cornfields. In the winter, when the snow fell, that vulnerability became a palpable, living thing. This particular night, the snow was coming down in earnest. Not a gentle flurry, but a thick, wet, heavy blanket that was already making the roads impassable. The power had been out for an hour, and I was curled up on the couch, reading by the light of a dozen candles and the glow from my fireplace. It was, for a moment, peaceful. The house was warm, the world outside was muted and white, and I felt secure in my little fortress. That's when I heard the knocking. It wasn't a frantic, urgent banging, but a slow, methodical knock. Thump, thump. It was coming from my front door. My heart jumped into my throat. No one should be out here, no one. The road would be a nightmare. My nearest neighbors were 2 miles away, and they were an elderly couple who wouldn't dream of venturing out in this weather. I crept to the door, my stockinged feet silent on the cold wooden floor. I peered through the peephole. The porch light was out, of course, but the ambient light from the snow-covered ground cast a faint, ghostly glow. I could make out a figure. A man. He was tall and broad, covered in snow, his shoulders hunched against the cold. He wasn't wearing a proper winter coat, just a thin-looking jacket. My mind raced. Every horror movie, every news report I'd ever seen screamed at me to keep the door locked. Don't engage. Pretend you're not home. But then he knocked again, and this time, a voice followed, faint through the thick wood. "Hello, please, my car, it went off the road. I just need to use a phone." His voice didn't sound menacing, it sounded desperate and cold. I was torn. The primal, self-preservation part of my brain was at war with the part that was raised to be a good person, to help people in need. Leaving someone out in a blizzard like this, it could be a death sentence. Against my better judgment, I decided on a compromise. I opened the door just a crack, leaving the chain lock securely in place. "I can make a call for you," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "Who do you need me to call?" The man looked up. His face was pale, his lips tinged with blue. Snow was caked in his eyebrows and hair. He looked utterly miserable. "Tow truck, my cell is dead. Please, miss, it's so cold. Could I just step inside for a minute to warm up while you call? I'll stand right by the door." I hesitated. The chain was strong, but the sight of him, shivering uncontrollably, chipped away at my resolve. What kind of monster would I be to leave him on the porch? I was a good person. I helped people. I made a split-second decision that I will regret for the rest of my life. "Okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Just for a minute." I unlatched the chain and opened the door. He shuffled inside, bringing a blast of cold air with him. He was even bigger up close, towering over me. He stomped the snow from his boots on the mat, a grateful smile spreading across his chapped lips. "Thank you," he breathed, the words forming a cloud in the chilly air of the entryway. "Thank you so much. You're a lifesaver." He stayed right by the door, just as he promised. I felt a small wave of relief. Maybe I had done the right thing. I grabbed my landline from the kitchen. A cordless phone, thankfully. and the number for the only Taos service in the area. They said it could be hours. I told him after I got off the phone. The roads are almost completely closed. They'll try to get to you as soon as they can. He nodded, his expression falling. Of course. I understand. He looked around my small, candlelit living room. This is a cozy place you have here. Thanks, I said, my hand tightening on the phone. The small talk was making me nervous again. I wanted him to go back outside, to wait in his car where it was at least sheltered. But I couldn't bring myself to say it. You know, he said, taking a step further into the house, away from the door. It's funny. I was just thinking a house like this, so far out you must get lonely. I like the quiet, I said, taking an involuntary step back. I bet, he said, his smile never wavering. It was a nice smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were constantly scanning the room, taking in the details. The single coffee mug on the table, the one pair of boots by the door, the lack of any pictures of a husband or children on the mantel. He was inventorying my solitude. He started to wander around the living room, picking up little trinkets, looking at my books. You're all alone out here, aren't you? He asked, his back to me. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. My husband will be home any minute. I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. He's just clearing the neighbor's drive with his truck. He turned around slowly, that same pleasant smile on his face. As he now. That's funny, because I didn't see any truck tracks in your driveway when I walked up. Just the one set of tire tracks from your little car. And they look a few days old. The blood drained from my face. He had been lying. His car hadn't gone off the road. He had walked here. He had chosen my house. The friendly, desperate traveler was gone. In his place stood a predator. The change was so sudden, so complete, it was like a mask had been dropped. His eyes were cold and hard. What do you want? I whispered, my voice trembling. I just wanted to get out of the cold, he said, his voice dropping to a low, conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. And you were kind enough to let me in. It's important to be a good person, isn't it? To help those in need. He was mocking me, throwing my own compassion back in my face. He took another step towards me. I took another step back, my back hitting the kitchen counter. My mind was a blur of panic. The fireplace poker, the heavy cast iron skillet on the stove. My escape routes were all cut off. The front door was behind him. The back door was on the other side of the kitchen. You have a very trusting face, he continued, as if we were discussing the weather. I saw it when you looked through the peephole. I knew you'd be the one to open the door. He saw me. Through the peephole, that was impossible. It was a one-way lens. Unless he had been here before. Peering in my windows, watching me, learning that I was alone. The car trouble wasn't a lie to get help. It was a script, a test, one that I had failed spectacularly. He lunged. It wasn't fast or aggressive. It was a casual, almost lazy movement. But I reacted on pure instinct. I spun around, grabbed the heavy, cordless phone from the counter and swung it with all my might at the side of his head. It connected with a sickening crunch. He staggered back, a look of genuine surprise on his face. The smile was gone. He raised a hand to his temple, and when he brought it back, it was slick with blood. His eyes, which had been cold before, were now blazing with fury. That was my only chance. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I bolted. I ran for the back door, fumbled with the deadbolt, and threw myself out into the blizzard. The cold was a physical shock. The snow was up to my thighs. I didn't have a coat or shoes, just my sweater and socks. But I didn't care. I just ran. I plunged into the cornfield behind the house, the frozen stalks tearing at my clothes and skin. I could hear him shouting behind me, enraged. I didn't look back. I just kept running, stumbling through the deep snow, my lungs burning, my feet turning numb. The only thing on my mind was the image of his eyes, and the terrifying knowledge that I had invited him into my home. I don't know how far I ran. Eventually, I collapsed, my body giving out. I was sure he would find me, that I would freeze to death in that field. But then I saw headlights. A pair of big, beautiful headlights cutting through the snow. It was the tow truck. The driver must have seen my frantic escape from the house. The man was gone by the time the police arrived. He had vanished back into the storm as mysteriously as he had appeared. They found a small camp set up in the woods about half a mile from my house. He had been there for days, watching me, waiting for the perfect opportunity, the perfect cover. The blizzard. I sold the farmhouse. I live in a city now, in an apartment building on the 10th floor with a doorman and a dozen locks. I don't make eye contact with strangers. I don't answer my door unless I am expecting someone, and even then, I hesitate. Because I learned the hardest lesson of my life that night. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the world isn't the monster you can imagine, but the one that preys on your own decency. He knew I would open that door. He was counting on me to be a good person, and that's the part that keeps me awake at night. He wasn't just a random threat. He was a test. And I know with a chilling certainty that in the world outside my locked door, there are countless others just like him, walking through the snow, knocking on doors, just waiting for a good person to let them in. My brother Mark and I bought a small rustic cabin together as a weekend getaway. It was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest paved road. The kind of place where your cell phone becomes a useless brick the second you turn off the main highway. Its only connection to the outside world was an old-fashioned landline telephone. It was part of the charm, we said. A real escape from the constant connectivity of modern life. I went up there by myself for a long weekend in February to get some writing done. Mark was supposed to come, but he got held up at work. I didn't mind. I loved the solitude. A snowstorm was forecasted, but I was prepared with enough food and firewood to last a week. As the first flakes began to fall, I felt a sense of profound peace settle over me. The first night was quiet and uneventful. But on the second day, with the snow coming down thick and steady, the phone rang. It was jarring in the deep silence of the cabin. I picked it up. Hello. Nothing, just static. A loud crackling hiss, like an untuned radio. Hello, is anyone there? I asked again. The static just continued for a few more seconds. Then the line went dead. I shrugged it off. The storm was probably messing with the ancient phone lines. It was to be expected. I went back to my writing. An hour later, it rang again. I picked it up. Hello. This time, it wasn't just static. Underneath the hiss, I could hear something else. A voice. It was incredibly faint, distorted, and seemed to be speaking in a language I couldn't understand. It was guttural and rhythmic. It sounded far away, like a transmission from another world. The sound made the hair on my arms stand up. After a few seconds of the strange, whispering language, the line cut out again. Okay, that was weird. Really weird. My rational mind tried to find an explanation. Crossed wires. Picking up a foreign radio station. Plausible, I guess. But it was deeply unsettling. The cabin suddenly felt a little less cozy. Throughout the day, the calls kept coming. Every hour, almost to the minute. Each time, it was the same thing. Static, and underneath it, the faint, disturbing, rhythmic whispering. I stopped answering. I let it ring, the shrill sound echoing through the small cabin, each ring fraying my nerves a little more. What had been a charmingly rustic feature of the cabin now felt like an instrument of torture. As night fell, the storm intensified. The wind howled through the trees, and the snow beat against the windows. I tried to ignore the phone, but the anxiety was a knot in my stomach. The fifth time it rang, something made me pick it up. I don't know why. I just had to. Who is this? I demanded into the receiver, my voice shaking. The static hissed. And then through the noise, a new sound emerged. It was a voice, but it wasn't the strange, rhythmic whispering. It was my voice. It's probably just the storm messing with the lines. The voice on the phone said. I dropped the receiver as if it were red hot. It clattered against the wooden floor, still emitting the awful static. Those were the exact words I had said to myself, out loud, after the first call. It was a perfect recording of my own voice. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, my mind reeling. This wasn't a crossed wire. This wasn't a radio signal. Something or someone was listening to me. Not just listening, recording me, and playing it back. The implications were horrifying. Was the cabin bugged? Was someone outside with some kind of sophisticated listening device? I ran to the windows, peering out into the black, swirling chaos of the blizzard. I saw nothing, just the endless night and the falling snow. My sanctuary had become a fishbowl. Every word I'd muttered to myself, every frustrated sigh, every time I'd talked to myself, had it all been heard? The thought was a profound violation. I felt naked, exposed. I unplugged the phone from the wall. The silence was a relief, but it didn't make me feel any safer. The threat wasn't the phone itself. The phone was just the messenger. The threat was the listener. I spent the next hour in a state of paranoid terror, searching the small cabin. I looked for microphones, cameras, any sign of surveillance. I found nothing. The cabin was exactly as it had always been. This made it worse. The threat was invisible, intangible. Exhausted and terrified, I decided I had to re-establish contact. I needed to know more. Maybe I could reason with them, find out what they wanted. It was a stupid idea, born of desperation, but I felt like I had to do something. I plugged the phone back in. For a long time, nothing happened. The silence stretched on. I began to think that maybe, just maybe, I had imagined it all, that the stress and isolation had caused an auditory hallucination. Then, the phone rang. My hand trembled as I lifted the receiver to my ear. I didn't say anything this time. I just listened. The static was there. But then a new recording started. It was a conversation. "I'm heading up to the cabin for the weekend," a voice said. It was my voice. "Yeah, Mark can't make it, just me." Then, another voice responded. "That's perfect. The storm is coming. No one will be able to get up there for days." It was my brother, Mark. It was a recording of the phone call I had with my brother 2 days ago. The call where I told him I was going up to the cabin alone. My blood ran cold. This wasn't someone who had bugged the cabin recently. This wasn't someone sitting outside in a van. This was someone who had access to the phone line itself. Someone who had been tapping our calls, listening for who knows how long. They knew I was coming. They knew I would be alone. They knew the storm would trap me here. This entire thing was planned. The recording on the line continued. It was a jumble of snippets from my conversation with Mark, cut up and rearranged. Just me alone for days, perfect, trapped. It was a taunt, a message, a clear, deliberate threat constructed from my own words. I slammed the phone down. I had to get out. I didn't care about the blizzard. I would rather freeze to death in the woods than stay in this cabin for one more second. I threw on my coat, grabbed my car keys, and burst out the front door. The wind and snow hit me like a physical blow. It was a total whiteout. I couldn't see more than 5 feet in front of me. My car was just a vague, white lump a few yards away. I waded through the deep snow, my heart pounding with a desperate, frantic rhythm. As I reached the car and fumbled with the frozen lock, I heard a sound over the howl of the wind. It was coming from the cabin. It was the phone ringing again, and again, and again. It didn't stop. It just kept ringing out into the empty, snow-choked forest, a beacon of my terror. I finally got the door open, threw myself inside, and cranked the engine. The car sputtered, but thankfully, it started. I didn't bother trying to turn around. I just floored it, plowing through the snowdrift at the end of the driveway and onto the unplowed dirt road. It was reckless, stupid. I almost went into a ditch a dozen times, but I didn't care. I drove for what felt like an eternity, the phone still ringing in my memory. Finally, I hit a stretch of road that had been plowed, and I knew I was going to make it. When I got back to civilization, I called the police. I called the phone company. They investigated. The official report was that there had been a technical fault on the line due to the storm causing signal crosstalk and anomalous feedback loops. They said it was a 1 in a million fluke. They couldn't explain the recordings of my voice, of my conversation with my brother. They dismissed it as part of the anomalous feedback, a jumble of sounds that my stressed-out brain had interpreted as voices. But I know what I heard. It wasn't a feedback loop. It was intelligent. It was malicious. It was someone who had turned my only connection to the outside world into a weapon against me. Someone who enjoyed the game, who enjoyed listening, and who wanted me to know that I was being listened to. Mark and I sold the cabin. I couldn't bring myself to even think about going back there. I still have a landline in my apartment, but sometimes, on a quiet night, I look at it and I feel a chill. I think about the invisible wires that connect us all, the lines that run over our heads and under our feet. And I wonder who else might be listening in, just waiting for the right moment, the right storm, to pick up the phone and whisper your own words back to you in the dark. I've always had a thing about reflections. Not in a vain way. They just bother me. The way they show you a perfect, reversed copy of the world. The way a reflection in a dark window shows you not just yourself, but the room behind you, superimposed on the world outside. It feels like looking into another, slightly off dimension. My ex-girlfriend used to say I was too imaginative for my own good. After what happened in that little house on the coast, I think she might have been right. I was renting a small, one-story house for the winter in a sleepy coastal town. It was the off-season, so the place was a ghost town, which was exactly what I wanted. I'm a composer, and I needed quiet to finish a score. The house was perched on a small cliff overlooking the ocean, and the entire back wall was a single, huge pane of glass, a picture window that gave a stunning, panoramic view of the churning, gray sea. One night in January, a massive blizzard swept in from the ocean. It was a raw, violent storm. The wind screamed like a dying animal, and the snow wasn't the fluffy, picturesque kind. It was wet and heavy, flying almost horizontally, sticking to every surface. The power grid in the area was notoriously fragile, and sure enough, around 8 p.m., everything went dark. The silence that followed the blackout was immediate and total, save for the roar of the storm outside. I lit a few candles, their flickering light casting long, dancing shadows across the room. The house felt small and isolated, a tiny pocket of warmth against the immense, raging chaos of the ocean and the snow. I was sitting on the couch, just watching the storm, when the first flash of lightning lit up the sky. It was thunder snow, a rare and eerie phenomenon. For a split second, the entire world outside was illuminated in a stark, bluish, white light. And in that same split second, the giant picture window became a perfect, flawless mirror. In that flash, I saw the reflection of the room. The couch I was sitting on, the flickering candles on the coffee table, the bookshelf against the wall. And I saw my own reflection. But I wasn't alone. Reflected in the glass, standing directly behind my couch, was a man. He was tall and gaunt, with a pale, narrow face and dark, hollowed-out eyes. He was just standing there, motionless, staring at the back of my head in the reflection. Then the darkness returned, and he was gone. I gasped, spinning around so fast I nearly fell off the couch. There was no one there. The space behind the sofa was empty. The room was empty. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. My mind was screaming. You imagined it. It was a trick of the light. A shadow. You're overtired. I told myself it was just the weirdness of the thunder snow, the flickering candlelight, my own overactive imagination playing tricks on me. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm the frantic pounding in my chest. I was alone. Of course, I was alone. I turned back to the window, my body tense. I stared out into the roaring darkness, waiting. A few minutes later, another flash of lightning tore across the sky. The window became a mirror again, and he was there. He was in the same spot, but he had moved. His head was tilted slightly, as if in curiosity. A faint, thin smile was on his lips. It was a terrible, knowing smile. He was reflected in the glass, standing in my living room, and he was looking right at me. Then darkness. I scrambled off the couch, my legs feeling weak and unsteady. I backed away, my eyes locked on the spot where he had been standing. I fumbled for my phone on the table, switching on its flashlight and shining the beam into the empty space behind the couch. Nothing. There was nothing there. This wasn't my imagination. I had seen him, twice, clear as day, but he only existed in the reflection, and only for the second the lightning flashed. Panic began to set in, cold and sharp. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? Was this a ghost? I didn't believe in ghosts. But the evidence was right there, in the afterimage burned into my retinas. I couldn't stand to look at that window anymore. I needed to cover it. But I couldn't find a curtain or a blind big enough. The owner liked their view unobstructed. I was trapped in a room with a giant, black mirror, just waiting for the next flash of lightning to reveal the man standing behind me. I huddled in the corner of the room furthest from the window, my knees pulled up to my chest, my phone's flashlight beam cutting a nervous, trembling path through the darkness. The storm raged on. Every few minutes, the sky would flash, and against my will, my eyes would dart to the reflection on the other side of the room. Flash. He was closer now. No longer behind the couch, but standing in the middle of the room. His smile was wider. Flash. He was next to the dining table. One long, pale hand was resting on the back of a chair. Flash. He was by the fireplace, his head tilted, watching me. He was moving. With every flash of lightning, he was taking a new position in the room, drawing a slow, deliberate circle around me. But only in the reflection. In the real room, lit by my flashlight, I was completely alone. I was caught in a waking nightmare, a psychological horror film playing out in real time. The fear was unlike anything I had ever known. It wasn't the fear of a physical threat, of a home intruder I could fight. It was the fear of the impossible, the fear that the laws of reality were breaking down around me. Was he a product of my mind, or was my mind the only thing that could perceive him? I started talking to myself, my voice a ragged whisper. You're not real. You're not real. Flash. He was standing right in front of me now, just a few feet away. In the reflection, he was so close I could see the details of his face. He looked sad. He slowly raised a hand and pointed. Not at me, but at the window itself. Then darkness. My mind was on fire. What did it mean? What was he trying to tell me? I was so focused on the phantom in the room that I had stopped thinking about the outside world. But the pointing finger, the gesture, it was a change. It felt like a clue. My fear was momentarily replaced by a sliver of desperate curiosity. The next time the lightning flashed, I forced myself to look closely at the reflection. At him. He was in the same spot, still pointing. But my eyes followed his finger, to the reflection of the window itself. And behind it, in the reflection of the roaring black ocean, I saw something else. A light. A small bobbing light far out at sea. My brain struggled to process it. A boat. In this storm. Impossible. I scrambled to the window, my fear of the man momentarily forgotten. I pressed my face close to the cold glass, shielding my eyes from the candlelight, and peered out into the real, physical darkness. I waited for the next flash. It came, and I saw it. It wasn't a reflection. Out on the waves, being tossed violently by the storm, was a small boat. And on its deck, a figure was waving a flashlight, a tiny beacon of desperation in the overwhelming chaos. A stranded sailor. A real person in real trouble. The man in the reflection, he hadn't been a threat. He had been a warning. He had been trying to get my attention, to make me look outside. I grabbed my phone and dialed the Coast Guard. My voice was trembling as I explained what I was seeing. They told me to keep a light on in the window, to act as a landmark for them. For the next hour, I stood by that terrible window, my phone's flashlight aimed out at the sea. The thundersnow continued. Every time the lightning flashed, the room behind me was reflected in the glass. And he was there. He was standing right behind me, a silent, spectral guardian, his image superimposed over the raging storm. He never moved again. He just stood there, watching me, as I helped save the life of the person he had shown me. The Coast Guard eventually rescued the sailor. The storm passed. The power came back on. The sun rose, and the world was clean and bright. I looked in the window. All I saw was my own tired face and the calm, blue sea behind me. He was gone. I never saw him again. I can't explain what happened that night. Was he a ghost? The spirit of a lost sailor, trying to prevent another tragedy? Or was he just a figment of my own stressed-out mind? A psychological projection that my brain created to alert me to something my subconscious had noticed. I don't have an answer, but I no longer fear reflections. I respect them. I understand that they show us things that aren't always there. But I also know that sometimes in the dark, when the world is reversed in the glass, you might just see something that is, and you have to be brave enough to look.